Hello, today we'll be presenting our paper, Evolving SIMGANs to Improve Abnormal Electrocardiogram Classification. So one problem in certain domains is that collecting real-world data can be difficult and or expensive. And to kind of alleviate this, simulations can often be used as they provide a really clear, reproducible representation that's founded on mathematical and physics principles, meaning that even if you can't collect some data, we can mimic some real world stimuli. However, some problems with some simulations is that they may not capture the full complexity of the real world. And some examples of this are that the real world often has noise, either from like sensors that collect the data, other phenomenon that simply the simulations are not handled to reproduce. Now, for example, in our paper, we have approached the problem of ECG applications for arrhythmia classification. So, collecting ECG heartbeat signals from real subjects is really difficult because all the patients slash subjects that we collect the data from need to be properly anonymized, and we need a domain expert or professional like a doctor to properly classify and understand the data that's being collected. There are existing simulators that can try to reproduce certain ECG signals and heartbeat data. However, the existing simulators can't produce unhealthy heartbeats, which are oftentimes more valuable as rare conditions or unseen conditions or unhealthy conditions are what are more important, as that is what we're trying to identify and classify in many applications. The amount of data for unhealthy heartbeats is lower and inherently more valuable. We wanted to approach the problem of how can we generate or produce ECG signals that can be used for various applications like classification without needing to rely on real subjects. And another thing to note for the existing simulators that do produce like healthy heartbeats, sometimes the simulations are a little too clean in a sense, as in that they do not capture real world noise or some other phenomenon that often happen with the human body. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see that these are some examples. So on the left, we can see that this is a real ECG heartbeat collected from the MIT BAH database. And as you can see, there's a lot of electrical noise from the leads when you collect this data. And then particularly at this point, this is a abnormal heartbeat. And on our right, we see that these are various heartbeat simulators that, as you can see, they do not have the type of electrical noise that you see in real world data. A lot of the heartbeats themselves are incredibly regular compared to real world, where the heartbeat can fluctuate. And particularly, none of them have the capability of reproducing some of these more abnormal conditions. Now, generative adversarial networks, other known as GANs, are an incredibly powerful and a successful model used to generate synthetic images. And it does this by training two neural networks that compete with each other to improve each other's predictions. One model, known as the generator, generates synthetic images from original random input, like random vectors, noise, etc., and it produces samples. The discriminator network then is trained on the real images and the generated images and tries to predict which ones are real or fake, and then provides some feedback to the generator through the losses calculated. Now, like we mentioned before, traditional GANs are their generative models start from random noise. And a modification to the GAN framework that we are using is known as SimGANs, where instead of starting from random noise, you start from the simulator's output, and we use that as the input to the GAN instead. The generative model instead now tries to refine the synthetic model to improve the realism of it. So as you can see from the original paper in their diagram, they had a simulator which produces synthetic eyes images, and then we pass it through the refiner, which has been trained on real and synthetic images to try and to improve the synthetic images to match more realistic images found in the real data set. And effectively, the ideas behind this is that if we start with the simulated input, we have a strong foundation. However, the simulators often aren't complex enough to capture a lot of realistic artifacts or features, which leads to some issues later on if we use just pure synthetic images to train our models, which is why the refiner is meant to expand the data set by making the synthetic images a lot more realistic and effectively can be used in a lot more applications than just the original synthetic images alone. Now, one advantage that SimGANs have over traditional GANs is that there's more supervision and more specificity to the type of data that it produces. Because since we start from a simulation, the simulation has various conditions or parameters that it's meant to mimic. And therefore, the SimGAN, instead of just starting from random noise and making whatever, it can instead create data with that as a basis and should not try to deviate too much from the original simulation due to one of the loss functions used during SimGAN training, giving it some sense of supervision. We now introduce our novel end-to-end evolutionary framework called Easy Cartesian Genetic Programming, shortened to EasyCGP. Now, EasyCGP is meant to be a simple, customizable framework that optimizes neural network creation, whereas instead of using traditional tree-like representations like traditional genetic programming, we use graph representations, which better fit a lot of neural network architectures. Now, our framework condenses model training, evaluation, neural architecture search, and hyperparameter tuning all together into an automated process that is optimized through evolution. And we applied this framework to our problem with our SimGANs, where we started with a fairly simple SimGAN architecture, used it as a seeded population for our first generation. And then we tried to optimize our models and search for novel architecture configurations using EasyCGP, and they were all trained and evaluated using multiple objectives we defined. Now, to go into it a bit more, as you can see from this figure, this is how we kind of define our individuals and genomes. So an individual can be made up of multiple blocks. And within those blocks, it can be made up of multiple operators, and each operator has its own hyperparameters and arguments that it can be used. So as you can see here, we start with an input with this genome effectively has an input block and an output block. And then each block here can be a various function, such as like a convolutional layer or a dropout layer, etc. And then each operator can effectively have its own hyperparameters. And then what our framework does is that it finds active connections between these nodes and uses the parameters defined. And then as evolution occurs through mating and mutation, some of these blocks can switch places, can be replaced with a different operator, or can be exchanged with other individuals. And then, or hyperparameters themselves can be randomly changed through mutation. Connections can be changed between active blocks and inactive blocks. They can decide to be used or not used. And then through evolution, ideally, new configurations between new connections or just new orderings of blocks, we should be able to find new neural network architectures very easily while also being able to tune the hyperparameters for it. Now, here's just a quick overview of some of the important primitives slash operators that we used for our SimGAN problem. So obviously, GANs and SimGANs are deep neural networks. So they utilize a lot of convolutional blocks, concatenation layers, like linear layers. Importantly, we also included a ResNet block as a primitive, as it's seen a lot of success in a lot of domains. And then just for the actual pseudocode of the kind of evolutionary process of EasyCGP, you initialize the population with either a seeded individual or just randomly produced individuals. And we continue this evolutionary loop for however many defined generations we want or until it converges. And effectively, each parent rolls a random number to determine whether or not it should mate or mutate. And then each block within an individual has a certain probability of mating or mutating, which allows for novel changes and seeing what happens. And then once the new population of individuals is defined, we obviously train the GAN or SimGAN and then score it across the defined objectives. And then eventually we select a new population for the next generation, and this continues. Now, to begin with our problem, we have a simple initial architecture for a SimGAN that we found were fairly successful with our initial thoughts. So an individual for our SimGAN approach is defined with three blocks. So there's the training configuration block, the refiner, the generative model block, and then finally the discriminator block. And then each of these blocks have their own operators within them. So as you can see for the discriminator, it uses a lot of convolutional networks, Boolean layers, and then has some feature extraction along with it to effectively make the neural network. Now, we had some success with this initial model from initial tests, and then we used it as our initial seed to help jumpstart the evolution in a sense. Now we go a bit more in depth into our evolutionary setup. Mating was done with a 33% probability, mutation was done with a 20% probability, and we started with an initial population of 4, where we took in our seed from the previous slide, mutated it 4 times to get 4 children, and then started from there. For each generation, we maintained a Hall of Fame of 40 individuals, and then the next generation was scored and selected using NSGA2, and this was run for 48 hours on a single node. Now, GAN evaluation is an open problem as it's difficult to find a quantitative measurement of how good a synthetic produced image is. However, in our approach, since our data is ECG heartbeat data, it's 1D, a lot of the traditional GAN metrics aren't super applicable here. However, we did manage to use the following 4 objectives. One, minimizing a 1D version of FID score, which is a traditional 2D GAN image objective, being defined as the distance between the feature vectors of the real images and the feature vectors of the fake images using the trace of the square matrix. And then 2, we're minimizing the KS statistic, which is a distance measurement between the features of the refined images and the features of the real images, as the idea is that the real and refined images should have very similar features, and therefore the feature distribution distance between them should be very small. Similarly, another objective is the average p-value of the feature distributions. We used 11 features, and then we measured how statistically significant the difference between the feature distributions are. Ideally, the refined signals that we produce should be very similar to the real signals in our dataset. Therefore, it should not be statistically significant, and the p-values should be fairly large. And our final objective is similarly just minimizing the number of different features that were significantly different from the real distributions. Now, after we used EasyCGP and allow it to run for approximately 10 generations, here's an example of an evolved novel configuration. So for a refiner, it just changed it. Simply changed the type of activation it used. The original one used our original seeded individual had a leaky ReLU instead. And then for a discriminator, it gets a little bit more interesting, as it opts to not use a feature extraction primitive that we originally seeded it with, and instead adds in another dropout layer as well. And here are some examples of the generated ECG data from our SimGANs. So as we see here, the top signal is our original simulated signal, where as you can see, it's very regular. There's no noise in it. The bottom signal is a random example of a real electrical signal. And as you can see, there's a lot more electrical noise. The heart rate is faster. And then our second signal from the top is our initial seeded individual, the resultant find signal that it produces. And as you can see, it learns some electrical noise. It does have some of the faster heart rate as seen in the real one. However, we could change this by having a stronger regularization effect to have it mimic the heart rate of the simulation. Similarly, the second signal from the bottom is our evolved individual. And as we can see qualitatively, we can see that some of the signals look a little strange. There appear to be some artifacts within the signal, such as not having as prominent as a dip after the initial peak. However, we can see that it also learns a lot of the electrical noise and maintains a similar pattern from our initial seeded individual. Now, it is important to note that both individuals are proto-optimal. In fact, our seeded individual was proto-optimal for multiple generations. However, our evolved individual was shown to be optimized across some of our 4 objectives, so quantitatively, it did show improvement. And now for an empirical analysis of the quality of the signals produced, is that we trained a variety of ECG classifiers using variations of just real data, and then real data with the normal simulated, just the raw simulated data, the real data with the refined signals that were abnormal, and then compared it between the individuals that were from the first generation that we seeded versus later generation. And as we can see on a variety of models like AdaBoost, multi-layer perceptron, etc., we see that generally models trained with the refined signals that were considered abnormal were often had a higher F1 score. And we believe this to be that our refiner effectively is able to transform these healthy simulated heartbeats into unhealthy heartbeats that are realistic enough to where it adds extra data to the training set and allows for these classifiers to better learn what unhealthy heartbeats look like and is therefore better able to better classify whether a heartbeat is normal or abnormal. And in the future, we hope that to use our approach and our framework on different types of one-dimensional data. Like we said, this was just a fairly simple ECG application, but there's also audio, EEG, time series data. There are also alternative powerful model architectures like transformers, and the nature of GANs and discriminator and refiner networks allows it to be coevolution to be a fairly strong solution, which is noted in fairly other related works. We also suggest that we could model the loss function as a symbolic regression problem, as there are a lot of components to the losses between the refiner discriminator and their own individual needs. Thank you.